What's up? I'm Andrew from the band Ripped to Shreds, and today we are answering the question, what is the difference between Goregrind and death metal?
Well, the lyrics gotta be gory. There needs to be a fair amount of blast beats. It does not have to be all blast beats. Typified by shorter songs. A lot of times it will have the dual vocal approach of low vocals and high vocals. There's about like 10 to 15 ingredients. You could have like max 8 and you're still Goregrind. But you gotta have gory lyrics.
With all due respect to Dr. Sewage, I disagree about the lyrics. I think that was true in the early 90s when Goregrind was still being defined. But in 2025, the musical traditions have ossified to the point that we can objectively analyze them, and more to the main question of this episode, we can examine what makes a piece of music Goregrind and what makes it death metal. Let's start with the original, Carcass. So that frenzied detruncation riff is a fairly standard napalm death style riff. The arrangement of the full song is very modern, still used all the time to this day. Several short bursts of blasting, separated by abrupt stops, and going into some tupa tupa tupa, and then going back into a blast and ending. The first album, Reputrefaction, is grindcore, and Symphonies has moments of grind. That's mostly a death metal album. And some of the things unique to Carcass, compared to other grind bands, became hallmarks of Goregrind, even though they weren't used necessarily verbatim for every single band. And this is an example of an napalm death riff that's very similar to Frenzy Detruncation. It's mentally murdered. Here's another bit from Reputrefaction called Excreted Alive. This is the intro part. The blast part goes. So that intro slidey bit, half step, down a fourth, half step, was something that was kind of popular among British bands because Bolt Thrower used it a lot on their first and second albums. And I also believe Sacrilege UK. And those would have all been influences on Napalm and Carcass. But I think Carcass has used that kind of similar line in other songs before, and so it kind of became a Carcass-ism. The tremolo riff here is also pretty similar to this other napalm death riff from Negative Approach. But I think all of those tremolo riffs share a single ancestor. And that ancestor, of course, is Repulsion. Although Horrified wasn't released as an album until '89, the Slaughter of the Innocent demo, which is the exact same recording, was passed around in tape format since '86. So it predates Scum and Reputrefaction, and Napalm Death lifted verbatim a couple of riffs directly from Slaughter of the Innocent. Here's the Acid Bath riff, which goes into... You can see Napalm kind of lift that exact idea for Lucid Fairy Tale. And you can see that it's almost the same as that Acid Bath riff, just up a half step, and on the turnaround, instead of going, it goes. So it changes the note. So when we compare the riffs on Reek to Napalm Death and Repulsion, I think it's fairly obvious that we can call Reputrefaction a grindcore album. So what exactly makes it different from death metal? Here's two pretty fast riffs. This one's Autopsy, Charred Remains. 1, 2, 3, 4. This one's from Morbid Angel's Blasphemy, which was on the Kingdom Come demo that Jeff referenced being influenced by. I think the biggest difference between those riffs, which are, at a similar tempo, and the grind riffs from Napalm and Carcass and Repulsion, is where the accents fall on the riff. In Charred Remains, the accent is on the one of each measure. And in the Morbid Angel riff, I feel each accent is happening on the 1 and 3. Whereas for the grind riffs that I showed, whereas for the grindcore riffs, we feel it on every single beat of the measure or even more. Like Mentally Murdered, right? It's a... I think the rhythmic feel of the riff is 2 to 4 times as fast as those death metal riffs. So I think that's one of the biggest differences between death metal and grind riffs. But of course, you know, it's not a hard and fast rule. There are plenty of examples from both sides of the spectrum where that doesn't really hold true. This is Master's Unknown Soldier from their 1985 demo. That accent mostly falls on the 1 and the 3 for the most part, except of course on the turnaround, you know, da da da. But something about it feels very crusty, and I feel like if we sped it up like maybe 10% and put blast beats on it instead of the triplet double bass that it has, it would instantly start sounding like a grindcore song. I think Master was pretty influential on a lot of early death and grind bands. For me, this is a riff that could go either way. It could be grind or it could be death metal, depending on the context it's placed in and the drums. A lot of what separates grind from death metal is song arrangement. And it's definitely true that most grind songs are far, far shorter than the average death metal song. However, there is a grind band that took their name from Master, with songs that are no less than 2 or even 3 minutes long, which is, you know, double the typical Carcass song. So this is Terrorizer's Afterworld Obliteration. And then it goes into then it repeats a bunch of times. Terrorizer ends up repeating their riffs a lot before it moves on to the next one, which is why they're so long. And it goes into the music drops and they're about to start blasting. That's the main blast riff. Even though, you know, Terrorizer has these long songs, these simple, crusty riffs that are repeated many times, and where a death metal band would develop each riff and start introducing variations on each one as it moves from section to section, introducing in like feel changes with the snare moving from the 2 and the 4 to just the 3, or speeding up to double time and then into half time. But Terrorizer just plays like a punky section, and then they go on to the next punky section till it's time to the blast, and then they go to another punky section. It doesn't really develop the way that a death metal song does. And without any dbeats, Terrorizer does feel significantly more death metal. You know, similar to Master, they're from that primordial era of the 80s where thrash metal and death metal and grindcore were still all kind of the same thing, and it hadn't really been set in stone yet. So I think we have a decent grasp on what the difference between grindcore and death metal is. What's the difference between Goregrind and grindcore? Let's travel back to Carcass real quick. So on Malignant Defecation, they start with a dbeat riff like this. Before going into a blast riff, like... And this dbeat blast beat interplay is going to really define what Goregrind is 10 years later. And when we reach Symphonies of Sickness, they also have a similar construction on the song Reek of Putrefaction with the blast into the dbeat section. However, the rest of the song develops in ways that, you know, they start slowing down after that. They start playing a bunch of just death metal riffs, for lack of a better word. And they go back to this blast, dbeat a couple of times, but it's stretched out over 4.5 minutes. And overall, the effect that it gives me is way more death metal than grindcore. So I think without that continuous forward momentum being pushed forward by dbeats and blast beats and skanks, and then you break it up with some quick pauses and you drop right back into more dbeats and skanks and blasts. Without that forward momentum, even songs with grindcore parts stop being totally grind. As an aside, Excoriation Abdominal Emanation is another song on Symphonies, and I think the main blast riff on it is really interesting because it has that 1, 2, 3, and 4 accent that we've identified in other grind riffs, but to me it sounds totally death metal. Maybe because of the way it moves up a whole step, like this. It reminds me quite a bit of Incantation's Ibex Moon. But back to the difference between grind and gore. I think somewhere in the early 90s, dbeat became a lot less popular in regular grindcore. The aforementioned Terrorizer completely lacks dbeats. Ass Suck, no dbeats. Discordance Axis, no dbeats. Brutal Truth, a few, but very few. We get Harmony Corruption from Napalm, and they're completely death metal at that point. Nasum had some dbeats, but they relied mostly on blasting and fast stop-start parts for the majority of the music. Of course, we still have punky bands of Excruciating Terror, Agathocles, or Rot, and they still relied on dbeat as a primary rhythm for a lot of their songs. So maybe for that reason, modern bands would fuse their influence with gore to create mince gore in the late 2000s, early 2010s. And you can really see the importance of dbeat to Goregrind when we look at Regurgitate, which was one of the most influential gore bands after Carcass. This is Basic Torture Procedure from their 94 demo Concrete Human Torture. The blast riff is something like this. That's about a third of the song. The other 2/3 are just this dbeat riff. Another incredibly important hallmark of Goregrind are the groove parts, which are, I guess, influenced by the intros from stuff like Genital Grinder or Ruptured Impurulence. This is stuff that I think would sound super out of place on Napalm-style grindcore. Here's Hemorrhages Dilacerate from something something on Emetic Cult. From Regurgitate's Consumption, Combustion, that comes at the end of a Carnivorous Erection. That morphs from a simple halftime and it goes into a groovy backbeat. The drum work is an incredibly important part of Goregrind. A lot of the grooviness is something that you would never find in a lot of typical grindcore or death metal. Here's Dead Infection's Maggots in Your Flesh. And this is what the accompanying breakbeat under it sounds like. So I think that type of funky pattern with the ghost snare is, very rare in death metal. Some things similar to it show up in Terrorizer's Fear of Napalm, and I think some Parliamentarist Sodomy songs, but it's pretty rare. Cyjan from Dead Infection in particular is a master with those groovy beats. Here's the intro from the Anatomical Deeps. And then the blast riff introduces a new rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it hangs on to that first beat, 1, 3, 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, which is kind of cool. Then we come to one of the most influential Goregrind bands of the 90s, which almost every modern gore band tries to imitate in some way, is Last Days of Humanity. They cranked the tempo up to ludicrous speeds, they made the tin can snare ubiquitous, and their riffing style was a total departure from Carcass and death metal. Ulcerated awful. A lot of bands would end up doing that 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, the type of rhythm. You see it a lot in mincecore. You'd also see it with bands like Agathocles or Rot. That's a type of riff that you would never find in death metal. I wouldn't say you would never see it in regular grindcore, but a lot less. Another band that's extremely influential on modern gore bands, and to a lot of kids today, is Mortician. This is Ripped in Half. So I would say that song is, just a straight grindcore song. What really separated Mortician from grind and put them in the brutal death metal camp, they never really had an interest in connecting fast parts with other fast parts. They would slow down into halftime breakdowns, like this one from Witch's Coven. It's often claimed that, Goregrind is death metal plus grindcore, which I think is pretty obviously wrong. All three genres were being simultaneously invented. I've seen some people even claim that like brutal death metal is a major part of Goregrind, which, I mean, this is the intro of Suffocation's Pierced from Within. Obviously something no gore band ever does. Even off like Human Waste, we can look at Infecting the Crypts. The melodic contour of that is too long. The driving rhythms and the way the blast beats are broken up are in a way that is not at all idiomatic to grindcore. Could you take that tremolo riff and turn it into grindcore? Yes, but I think you would have to add in some like very stereotypical I mean, you could do it, but the way that it's presented as is, the blasts and the stops are broken up, it's just death metal. Certainly there are a lot of like mid-2000 bands like Phetopsy or Brodequin that were very influential modern gore bands that came in like the 2010s. But, that's already 20 years after Goregrind was already codified as a genre. Taking all these things that we've talked about into consideration, why do we perceive bands like Lymphatic Phlegm or Catasexual Urge Motivation, which they totally lack dbeats, they lack riffs with idiomatic rhythmic accents, and they lack carcass melodies, but we still see them as Goregrind? And there are multiple factors. I think these kind of go in order of importance. So A, there's the time period in which it was released. Having gore and violence themes and medical photos or crime scene photos were a lot more important than they are now. Second, there's the pitch-shifted vocals. That's the biggest factor that separates them from being regular grindcore and Goregrind. And then finally, and this is the least important one, is that they have very short strung structures. But I think Lymphatic Phlegm would probably be considered mellow death today if their songs were like twice as long and they had regular vocals instead of pitch-shifted vocals. There are plenty of bands that play riffs that are extremely unidiomatic for grindcore, like Gridley. Taka's riffs are super melodic in a vacuum with a regular skank tupa beat. They would be like heavy metal or melodeath. But by keeping the songs under a minute in length and using blast beats as the primary rhythm keeps the whole thing still feeling grind. An interesting question to ask is, can you have Goregrind without pitch shifted or low vocals? To me, that's something that really depends on what kind of gore riffs they're playing. In the early 90s, their Regurgitate had all screamed high vocals and no pitch shifters or lows at all. They would have been seen as a normal crusty grind band. At the same time, if Last Days had the same hyper blasting, the same extremely down-tuned guitars and riffs, it wouldn't matter what the vocals were. They would still be seen as gore. To sum up, what is the difference between Goregrind and death metal? For old bands, one, gore imagery and pitch shifters. Those are things that are not quite as relevant as today. I think as long as you're playing in a Regurgitate style or with a Last Days hyperblasting style, and you have the D beats, and you have some of the carcass style tremolo melodies, and low vocals in general, musically I think you would be a Goregrind band. That's all for today, folks. I have no messages today, so blast fast, eat ass, peace.